Hey there. In this lesson, we will discuss some terminology related to quadratic equations as well as define what a quadratic equation is. And then we'll also review the four methods for solving quadratic equations. So first, a quadratic equation is anything of the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So notice that we have an x squared. And we say that a cannot be 0 because if a is 0, then we just end up with bx plus c equals 0, and we know that that is linear. So in order to have a quadratic, we must have the squared term. And so some terminology related to it is standard form, that is just ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. A second degree equation is a quadratic equation. It's just another name for it. Much like a first degree equation is linear, a second degree equation is quadratic, a third degree equation would be cubic, and so on and so forth. So the zero product property from your algebra days, remember that if a times b is equal to 0, then either a equals 0 or b equals 0. Because the only way to get a product of 0 is if one of the two factors is 0. A repeated solution is just a solution that happens more than once. So for instance, if I had, say, x minus 2 cubed equals 0, we know that if we were to kind of multiply that all out, we would end up with a third degree equation, something to cube, which means that we would expect 3 solutions, but the only solution to this equation is 2, x equals 2, but it happens 3 times, so we would say that 2 is a repeated solution. And then a double root, also known as a root of multiplicity 2, is a solution that occurs twice. So similar to the example above, let's say that it was x plus 3 squared equals 0. Then x equals negative 3 is one solution, but it occurs twice because it was a quadratic equation. Therefore, we were expecting 2 solutions. We only got 1. Therefore, it must happen twice. Okay, let's move on with how we solve quadratic equations. So we're going to go through the 4 methods. So the first is the square root property. And the square root property just says we're going to take the square root of both sides of the equation. And so here I get 3x plus 1 equals plus or minus 2. 3x equals negative 1 plus or minus 2. So x equals negative 1 plus or minus 2 all over 3. So therefore x equals 1/3 and negative 1. So notice we've got 2 solutions there for this quadratic equation. So that's the square root property. Over here we're going to use the zero product property, but we first have to FOIL these out. And then we're going to factor this so that we can use the zero product property. So we know that we need a 2x and an x, and then I can put a negative 2 here and a positive 3 here. So if these two multiply together are going to be 0, that means either this is 0 or this is 0. So I get x equals negative 3/2 or 2. So there's the 2 solutions to this quadratic equation. That's using the zero product property. Next is completing the square. Now in order to complete the square, we have to have a coefficient of 1 on the x squared term. So I'm going to divide everything by 2. So I get x squared plus 4x, and I'm going to move the 3 over and divide it by 2, so I have negative 3 halves. Now in order to complete the square, we call it this because we're going to add something to both sides of the equation so that the left side is a perfect square trinomial. So what I do is I take half of the middle term, so half the 4, which is 2, I square it, and that's 4, so I add 4 to both sides. Now the benefit of that is that this is now x plus 2 squared. And let's see, that's 8 over 2 equals 5 halves. So now I can use the square root property, like in example 1 above, take the square root of both sides, and I end up with x plus 2 equals plus or minus the square root of 5 halves. And basically, if we were to rationalize that, we would end up with x plus 2 equals plus or minus root 10 over 2. And so x equals negative 2 plus or minus root 10 over 2. And let's get a common denominator. So that's negative 4 plus or minus root 10 all over 2. And that is two solutions, right? We have negative 4 plus root 10 over 2 and negative 4 minus root 10 over 2. So there's two solutions as we expected since we had a quadratic. And then the last is the quadratic formula, which is that x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And so we have a is 2, b is 7, and c is actually negative 1 because we would move the negative 1 over so that we had it in standard form. So x equals negative 7 plus or minus 49 plus 8 over 4. So x equals negative 7 plus or minus root 57 all over 4. Again, two solutions. Notice root 57 cannot be simplified, so we are finished here with that. So negative 7 plus root 57 over 4 is one solution, and negative 7 minus root 57 over 4 is the other. All right, let's look a little more closely at the quadratic formula. So how is that derived? So what we're going to do is we're going to complete the square on the quadratic formula. So the first thing we have to do is divide by a, and move the c over as well as divide by a. So there we go. So now, remember to complete the square, we're going to take half the middle term, so half of b over a is b over 2a, and we're going to square that. So that is b squared over 4a squared. And we have to add that to both sides. So now on the left, I've got x plus b over 2a squared equals, and if I were to get a common denominator here of 4a squared, then that is negative 4ac over 4a squared plus b squared over 4a squared. And so notice again that this is x plus b over 2a squared, and let's combine these and shift around the order a little bit so that I can lead with the positive 4a squared. And now we're going to take the square root of both sides, plus or minus the square root b squared minus 4ac over 4a squared. We can take the square root of 4a squared. It's 2a. So we end up with plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a. And when I bring this over to solve for x, I get negative b over 2a plus or minus b squared minus 4ac over 2a. And this is how we come up with the quadratic formula. So it's just completing the square on the general equation of a quadratic, which is ax squared plus bx plus c. All right, there you have it. and thanks for watching.